Hey, I'm Chris, and welcome to episode 14 of the Reunion Church podcast. This is Sunday Recaps, where we discuss a couple key points from the previous service for those that missed it, discussing how it may help you live out your faith. And now we're in week two. We're week two of the Grace Talk series. We just started it. We've had a really good turnout. Oddly enough, I think it was a completely different group this week versus last week, which is interesting. So we've had very different conversations, very different interactions. Before we jump into it, Andrew, what were your first thoughts? Just 2 weeks into this, we've been planning this for a while. Just overall impressions so far in the series.
Yeah, like as the series kind of goes on, I really started enjoying getting into the deeper components of, where grace starts affecting our more day-to-day stuff that we don't normally think about. And where we've kind of put certain things that would be considered law or even to the point of legalism that, again, we wouldn't normally think that's what they are, because we read it in Galatians, we read it about Romans, and we'd be like, oh yeah, this is not what I like. I would never do something like this. Like 100% I'm against it. And we think about the extreme cases, but then there's things that we do in our day-to-day that are very much that can fall in line with it. And as we start getting into, the point of the Old Testament, like what this week was about, we start breaking down, where in our lives we can start seeing this, and why it's important to watch for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, this is where, like, I know a lot of people last week were talking about, like, it was surface level, or it was just getting into the idea of grace. But this week was definitely a lot more in depth. We're getting into the weeds of it, of what grace means, what it looks like. And word on the street is, you used me as an analogy. What was this nonsense? The Sandbag story. Tell us a bit about that and how this somehow connects to grace.
Yeah. So you were in kids ministry. And so I took that opportunity to be able to talk about you.
Yeah.
And so so the way I kind of opened up was talking through a little bit about how we use things the way they were never intended to be used in the first place. And so I bought this sandbag on Amazon it's marketed as a kettlebell sandbag, and it's a light sandbag. It goes up to 20 pounds, and it's something that you're supposed to be just doing like kettlebell movements on, kettlebell swings, kettlebell press, some of those basic things. But when a strongman sees that, we see it as something of like, hey, let's throw it. And that's
as possible.
Right. And that's 90% of what, strongman implements are, is like stuff that's not what it was designed ever to be used for. There's a big rock in the ground. We're going to pick it up and put it on our chest. There's tree sap. We're going to put it on our arms and use it to help us pick up stuff.
Totally normal stuff, by the way. Every gym's cool with it.
Yeah. People love it. It's normal stuff. And so, I bought this kettlebell, and when I threw it, nothing happened. It was perfectly fine. But then when you grabbed it, your first swing, you broke it.
It was not the first swing. It was definitely not the first swing.
It was definitely 100% the first swing. You threw it and it landed right on top, and you broke the handle. And then we tried to fix it with duct tape. It worked for me, and then you broke it again. I remember I was like, why does it keep breaking? Why won't this work? And then you pointed out, well, it's not intended to be thrown 20 feet in the air. And a lot of times that's kind of how we approach how we kind of look at the Old Testament itself, of like, hey, how are we supposed to use this? And, or the law itself. And like, how do we use this? How do we read this? How do we interpret its use for us as Christians? What is its purpose for us here today? Because I've heard people go through it verse by verse, and there's a good way to use it, and then there's a way that is dangerous, that can be very dangerous as well. And the way that you interpret reading it will also go over into how you apply with works itself. Well, what do we do with our works? Again, there's a good way with them, but there's the right way to use them as well. But there's a way that in the end, like, we will get upset of like, why isn't this working? Why is it? Well, because you're trying to use works in the way that they were never intended to be used.
Yeah, and actually, when we really got into the scriptures for last night and what was kind of the focus, it seemed like Matthew 5, which is, the Sermon on the Mount, very famous sermon from Jesus. He kind of goes into what to do with the Old Testament looks like. Um, why of all the sermons would you kind of turn here as far as what Jesus said about the old? Because I mean, Jesus said a lot about the old covenant, the old way of doing things. He's introducing the new way. But why focus on the Beatitudes, which is like this uplifting, love people and love others? Like, why would you focus on the Sermon on the Mount to really go into this idea of how to look at the Old Covenant and the Old Testament?
Yeah, and I think the Sermon on the Mount is, in the Beatitudes and that whole section, Matthew chapter 5, is kind of this unique passage where we read it, we're like, oh my gosh, this is such a great verse. I love it. And it's so good. But we sometimes lose what it would have meant to the readers when they were the audience, when they would have heard this. And we have to remember, when Jesus came, he was not preaching a message that people would have understood. A lot of his ministry was trying to get people to understand, like, you guys think you understand what salvation is. You guys think you understand who the Savior is, but you are really missing the point. You're really missing the boat on this, right? Mm-hmm. And with Matthew chapter 5, it's not about, oh, look how great the Beatitudes are. And, we'll listen to those and how good those are. The Beatitudes really were very strange for the people in that day and age, because they were like, what do you mean, blessed are the, how is that even possible? Blessed are the poor, because in their mind, the poor were not blessed. Yeah. The people that were blessed were the people, like, God's favor were on the rich. So how is this even possible? And again, it was Jesus kind of helping them understand, like, we talked about this through the Ordinary Life series, like Jesus was helping them understand that you guys aren't getting what this is really about. And then he goes into a lot of different components about the law, where he opens up and says, hey, I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it.
Yeah. Matthew 5:17.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He wasn't trying to get rid of it. And, we read that, we're like, oh, yes, Lord, this is so good. But we kind of miss the point of the verses following that, of what that really meant again, where he starts using things like, hey, you've heard it say, do not murder. But I tell you, if you hate anyone in your heart, you've murdered. You've heard it say, do not commit adultery. But if you even look at a woman with lust, and he starts going through this list, and we start using that list, and we're like, hey, this is what you need to do. You can't hate people, and as a Christian, you need to get to this point, and you as a Christian, can't have lust, and pastors will use that as an illustration to go into, like, fighting pornography, and then they'll get into where later on he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else is of the devil, and they'll use that as a guilt trip to try and get you to commit to helping out with church and actually showing up and stuff. And it's all missing the point of really the context of what Jesus was saying. He was saying this because people were like, hey, I keep the 10 Commandments. I follow this. I'm good. I am Israel. I am saved. And I am going to earn my salvation, essentially. And Jesus is like, well, I don't think you've missed it. You've missed the point of this. Yeah. You've heard it say, like, you're good. You haven't murdered anyone. Well, no, you really have. You're not that good. Right. And he goes through all of these sections in here. And then the way he wraps it up, in case people didn't get it, he wraps it up and he says to him, oh, hey, you need to be perfect as I am perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Yeah. And you don't hear pastors usually teach on that. Of like, well, yeah, Jesus is perfect, but what about that call? Like, you must be perfect.
Yeah, literally. It's literally in there at the end.
Yeah. You verse 48, you have to be perfect. Well, you got to try your very best. No. You must be perfect. And so people completely miss the point of, that was the call. And so people weren't walking away feeling good about this. People walking away looking like, oh, I suck, actually. And yeah, that was the point. Jesus was trying to get them to understand, like, right, you can't do this on your own. So it's something that a lot of pastors and a lot of times we've heard it in church, and the way it's kind of broken down misses the point of what Jesus was really trying to get people to understand around it.
Mhm. Yeah. And reading over the notes and reading over just how the lesson went, and in my own book, as I'm going through the series with everybody else, just going over the Sermon on the Mount again reminded me of a book that might help some of you who are kind of curious what the Sermon on the Mount meant. There's a great book by Skye Jethani that Narup Alphonse, our friend, recommended, called "What If Jesus Was Serious?" And it dives into what it really means and shows how off we are. Like what we think is the true takeaway of the Sermon on the Mount can actually be a toxic takeaway of I've got to do. Whereas, as Andrew just pointed out, it's no, you can't. That's the takeaway. You can't be perfect. You're called to be perfect, but you can't under the Old Testament. Kind of segueing from that, Andrew. So that's the really bad news. You can't do it, right? Well, what's the good news? Because that's terrible. That's terrible to find out. No one wants to get up and get along with the day and just, I'm the worst. I can't do anything. I'm useless. Like, that seems like a really negative way to approach life. So what's the good news in this whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is trying to understand, when we're focused just on the law and how, okay, well, so how do we make sense of this? The good news is that the law was never intended for you to try and do anything with it. It was always intended to be essentially a mirror, a reflection of showing the call is that you must be perfect, that you must be perfectly loving as God is loving, and that you must be perfectly holy as God is holy. And you can't. Like, you start realizing, I can't do this. I can't do any of this here. And it should humble you. It should get you to the point where you realize, I can't do any of this. And that's exactly where you want to get to. And that's what Romans talks about. Romans talks about, like, the point of the law is to humble you or silence your mouth. The law is then going to convict you of, like, man, I'm actually really, really bad. And then it's going to make you realize, like, you need a savior, that you need God, because no one goes to God unless they are humbled. And so you have to be humbled first. So the law has a really good point. It has a really good purpose. And it's to do just that. But outside of that, as a Christian, you're free from the law. That's what Jesus came to fulfill, is that, hey, you can't be perfect. I'll be perfect for you. And through me, you are perfect. You can't be holy. But through me, you are holy. And it changes how you view yourself. It changes how you're able to go about and even able to complete anything. Of, like, I can't actually do this. And it changes how you can actually respond to people. It removes a lot of the judgmentalness. It removes the holier than thou mindset of, like, hey, here's the standard where you need to be at. And if you don't meet this, you're not really a mature Christian.
Yeah.
And so it changes all those things for people. So it frees you up to be able to really serve people, to be able to really love people, and to be able to really see where God is leading you in that holiness, that loving, and that striving towards perfection, because God's already made you that way. And now it's just you walking in that, in humility and in faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And touching back on that response idea and how we respond to things in light of understanding that Jesus is the one who does it all, has it all, is the one who's in control of this whole journey that we're on. What's one practical takeaway that we can apply to each and every day? Like, maybe a practice that we can think about, or something we can implement to see grace in our lives, right? Like how do we activate grace is maybe a way to put it, based on this lesson.
So I think what we have to start evaluating is, you have to start evaluating, like, the why behind anything. I think part of the struggle that we've come into with the American mindset is a lot, and just most mindsets, because it's human nature to do this, is that we think I can earn this. And we've shared the American gospel story that we hear a lot, where I was at this point, but through my own efforts, my striving, my, this exact talent that I've had that I've been able to do. Now look where I'm at. I'm actually truly seen as this. I'm at my, people value me. I'm at a celebrity status. I'm acknowledged. And we put our minds in that gospel, that false gospel itself. And so we have to look at like, okay, what else am I playing out in my life that is putting myself in this works-based environment or law-based environment as well? Because that's what a lot of people did in that day and age, where they were like, hey, if I uphold these things, I will fulfill the law. I'll be perfectly fine in the law. And you miss out in a lot of that. So by trying to fulfill the law, by trying to be in the law, you miss out on a lot of the promises of God. And so there's a lot of freedom by letting go of that and trying to see if like, okay, I'm not going to focus on what I'm doing. I'm going to focus on why. Why are we going about doing this? For me personally, one of the things that was recent in this was around just the concept of fasting, right? Fasting, the way it's always been taught to me and the way that I had always learned about fasting was that fasting is really it's a practice that you do because it's a command, and you're denying the flesh so that you can sit there and just sit back and be like, hey, I am starving myself to put myself in a closer spot with God, so I can show God that I really, really want this prayer answered, more so than any other prayer, right?
Show how dedicated I am.
Yeah. Show how dedicated I am to like essentially earn God's answer in this point, right? And even though we may not use those words, that's why we're practicing this essentially. And that is not actually really a biblical view of fasting. And when you actually see how fasting was actually done, there's a lot of grace around fasting itself. And there's a lot of like, you have to depend on how God is actually speaking to you in that. And there's a relationship component in it as well, which only comes through grace. And so just look at the example around Jesus, Moses, Elijah, the first, like just those three who had the 40-day fasts. There was a powerful event that happened beforehand where there was a sacred moment, something powerful that God revealed something to them in. And when that happened, they went off and they fasted to try and make more sense of that moment. And in that fasting, usually there was a result from it, either an internal result within them or an external result, something like that came about from it.
And just to be clear, the idea of fasting is more so you're going about fasting trying to identify something versus trying to get rid of something. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Andrew, just to simplify the difference?
Kind of, right? It can be to try and identify something. It could be around like, yeah, it's in response to something, more or less, that God is doing something, that God has revealed something to you. And it's not you trying to get something out of it. But even Daniel, when he had his vision, he was like, oh, this is weird. And so he fasted around it, right? Because he's like, I don't understand this,
Right. Yeah, he was tripping.
Yeah. And so like those were the biblical concepts of like why you fast. And when you think about that, like, oh man, like there's a lot more freedom and there's like a lot more willingness behind fasting at that point that, yeah, I'm all about that, as opposed to trying to like, man, God, would you please answer this? And I'm going to fast and try to earn this. And that feels like a lot of work, because it is. And that's not the way that God works in it.
Focus versus effort, more so.
Yeah. And a lot of people talked about like, their quiet times and trying to evaluate that. Like, is God focused around, you spending that 15 minutes every morning? Or are you listening? Or are you willing enough to kind of listen, like God saying, hey, why don't you go for a walk today instead? And just practice solitude. Or why don't you, whatever it might be. And so are you prepared enough to be able to listen to that relationship component with God and stepping out in faith and humility and listen to what God has to say over it, over your own tradition and ritual that you might have placed in that you have made almost a law-based action.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think even just that takeaway of God convicting and showing us new ways to connect with him is really critical, because even for myself personally, we've even talked about the benefits of just walking. But for someone who's wired like me, it seems incredibly useless of like, I'm walking nowhere for no reason, but then the whole purpose is just to connect with God. Like, yeah, that's it. You're just trying to focus. You're trying to recenter. There's no goal. There's no, you don't check a box. You're just walking with God, you know?
Yeah.
Um, I think, because we have a lot of small group discussions after our service, for those of the people who are listening and don't know, what was kind of like one key question that stood out from people in the group that you thought was insightful, or just stood out, or just something that came up from the conversations on Sunday?
I I don't know if there was like a key question necessarily that like people were like, oh my gosh, that's a really good question. Um, but there are a lot of good discussions around uh, just like, oh man, if I'm really about grace, and if I'm really about letting go of this law, letting go of this Old Testament requirement over myself, and whatever it might be personally in my life, um, that can really change how I view people, how I view myself, how I'm gracious towards myself and kind to myself, how um, I'll be able to enjoy my time with God and not feel so burnt out and so tired of my quiet times or church.
Mhm.
Um, how I can enjoy my kids, how I can enjoy raising kids. And so there's a lot where people just naturally, when they just started talking through it, just conversation after conversation of people bouncing off, like, yeah, like if I set up so much um for the term that we like to use is ritual or rhythm itself, that disciplines,
Yeah.
when we're so tied up to those things and those are our standards of only what we stick by, um and that's our like that becomes our real standard itself, um that really can tie someone down with a lot of guilt and a lot of burdenship, and it makes you very judgmental of a lot of things. And I think people saw that, like, yeah, we need to let go of the what we're doing and focused on why we're doing that. And that's the process of discipleship. Discipleship, I think we need to spend more time focused on like why we do things and less time on like, hey, this is what you should do.
Mhm. Right. It's like telling a kid, don't touch the stove because it's hot. Well, actually, don't touch the stove because I don't want you to get hurt. That's the real reason. Same
Yeah.
mentality. Um, well, it was a really good conversation from what I heard. And I think we're going to continue this conversation next week. This idea of what's was the case and what is the case as far as the old covenant and new covenant on week 3 of Grace Talk. We hope you guys check it out.
Chris, tell us a little bit, like, you were in kids
Oh,
ministry.
oh yes. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. Like, I mean, there are parents that will be listening, like, and things like that. Like, what happens in kids? Like, people will look at kids
Oh,
ministry and sometimes and just be like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like, but
that's true.
you had a totally different experience in what was kind of going on back there. And our kid ministry director, Amber, has done a really great job with it from what I've heard. So
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I was just a volunteer, so I don't like run anything. Amber's the one who's the director of kids ministry. She crushes it. And honestly, as a volunteer, so we all take turns as a church. We're a local small congregation, so we all take turns with kids ministry. And it's honestly really smooth sailing. Like, it's really cool just to hang out with the kids. And Amber has this great I guess it's a methodology or a structure to how things go. Of like, there's playtime where you hang out. We played Foursquare, which was really fun out front. We played freeze tag, like just games and stuff. It was really fun for the kids. And then there were activities related to the Bible that they did. So our lesson was about Moses and um, how it was scary that baby Moses was in the river, sent away by his mom. We all know that story. And then we talked about, well, what's a scary thing that happened to you? And you'd be surprised how it was actually really introspective for me in a weird way, where, of course, from the mouth of babes, one of the kids, it was actually Luke, your son, Andrew, asked me a question that had me right in my feels of like, when was the last time you were scared? And I was like, oh, geez. Let me tell you, and I, of course, at their learning level. But I mean, bottom line is that Amber just, her leadership and the way she guides it is just incredible. And just being able to help out that week was really cool. Really awesome.
The craft sounds really cool too. It's like they're doing not your typical like, oh, cut out and draw things, but like they're doing like a basket weave, or I don't know art stuff, but
yeah, me neither. And the kids actually showed me how to do it because I was useless in that department. I have no ability in that front, but like even the activity was completely connected to the story of like, Jesus is kind of like our life draft. He's the one that carries us through the scary times. And we were making boats and rafts, and it was brilliant the way she tied everything together. So for anyone who does want to volunteer in kids ministry, highly recommend it. Amber's going to be the person you get in touch with. And it was really cool, really fun. So on that note, we're going to get back to it, guys, but thanks for listening. Again, every Sunday, 5:30 to 7:30 at the Reunion Coffee House, we are meeting. And we're going to give you a book. We have a book that we developed for Grace Talk. And snacks are provided. Kids ministry is provided. Again, if you have any kids that you want to bring, if you're in the neighborhood and want to check it out, we have signs where you can use a QR code and just see what's up on our website. And with that, we'll see you guys next week.